you do need a bit of capital to do this. And quite often you don't even need to actually settle on a property to make this happen. So we'll touch on this in a bit. So why do we want to buy a property, right? So we'll go over, we'll discuss this, but essentially buying a property, there's a few reasons. The first reason is obviously having a roof over your head, and also not needing to move, right? That's quite important. And this is more of like a physiological need. Okay. So the second is obviously a hedge against inflation. So property prices and general asset classes tend to go up when there's inflation. So when the government decides to print a lot of money, the money needs to go somewhere. So it usually falls into asset classes like property, stocks, cryptocurrency, etc. Buying a property is a good method to protect your savings and wealth. So the next one is obviously leverage. When you buy a property, you don't necessarily need the money. Like if it's $1 million property, you don't need to fork up $1 million. We can always borrow money from the bank to buy that property. You can go in as low as 5% deposit in some special circumstances, but otherwise the general minimum is 10% deposit. So if you're buying a property that's $1 million and you're going in with, say, 10%, if the property had 10% in capital gains and it's worth $1.1 million, you've made 100% on your initial deposit, essentially using the bank's money to make money. So the next thing is obviously building equity and wealth. So once you're in the game for a little bit longer, you can utilize the equity that you build up in the property as a deposit for another property. So oftentimes you can buy more property with no money down, right? Just using the equity that you have in the properties. So this requires a bit of time in the market. And sometimes if you lived through 2020 and 2021, you had a property, you would have massive gains. So you could use that equity sort of immediately and go to something else. And the last is obviously, pride of ownership, right? It's the psychological benefit of owning a property, right? It means that obviously you don't need to rent. For us Asians, one form of measure of wealth and success. So you might ask me like, okay, what options do I have? What can I do in my situation? When you're looking at borrowing money from the bank, there's always going to be two things they're looking at. There's more than two things, but two main things, right? It's your deposit and your income. So this is just a general overview of where you guys might be sitting. So if, say, for example, if you're two people buying together and each of you earn $75,000, generally you're able to borrow roughly around that $800,000 mark. And if you're maybe like a single borrower and earning $75,000, you might be able to borrow around $300,000. It's important to remember that everyone's in a different position, and there's no one strategy fits all. So there's going to be pros and cons in each strategy. The first one I'm going to share is the new build and off the plans. What a new build is, or off the plans, is agreeing to purchase a property from a developer while it's in the process of being built or before it's being built. Typically, what you do is you sign on a contract and you pay maybe 5% or 10% of the purchase price, and you might wait, say, a year or maybe even longer until you actually get the property. The benefits of off the plan property is you get to buy the property at the current market value, but when you settle, it's quite likely that the market's going to be a lot higher. So you get some instant equity in that purchase. So just an example for you, this is a client that we had. He's actually settling on his property in the next week or so. You can see that he bought this house for $945,000, right? This was actually signed just in November last year. You can see what it looks like. It's in Avondale. It's just a terrace house, I think it's 4 bedrooms, and with a garage. Well, so we got a valuation on this property just last week, and you can see that the new valuation is around 1.18 million. Before he even actually settled on this property, he made gains of close to $250,000. All the client did for this property was last November, he put down a 5% deposit. So 5% at the time was $48,000. With $48,000, he made capital gains of close to $250,000. So quite a good result for the client. Obviously, this is not going to happen in all scenarios, and this is probably a more extreme case where you buy in a market where it's heated up, and by the time it settles, the market's going to be you get a lot more value, a lot more capital gain on the property. But generally speaking, you will get some capital gain off the plans. But the next one we can look at is regional property and rent vesting. So this is sort of a strategy that one of our colleagues did, and essentially he bought a property in Timaru. So he had a bit of a deposit, roughly around like $70,000-$80,000, and instead of buying a property in Auckland, he bought a property in the regions in Timaru. So the pros of this strategy is you get to go in with a lower purchase price, right? This is only like a $350,000 property. And so a lower purchase price, a lower deposit, which is required. Some of you that might not have like a bigger deposit, you might consider these sort of strategies. So these properties in the regions typically have a higher yield, so higher rental return. So something like this, he's getting around like $450 per week, right? So if you had something like this in Auckland, that would be over $1 million, and the rent in Auckland would be like maybe $500 or $600, but the actual value is 3 or 4 times as expensive. So you can see that he's paying around $202 per week on his interest repayments, and the rental income is roughly $400. So there's going to be like an extra $200 that he can spend on his rates, insurance, maintenance, etc. So he doesn't have to put any of his own money into this investment to make it run. The cons of doing this is obviously if you have a KiwiSaver and you're buying in the regions, then you can't actually use your KiwiSaver to as a deposit to buy your actual house that you live in. So the next one is a cross lease and unit title, right? So these ones are going to be a lot more cheaper than buying a property with with a bit of land. So you can see this is a colleague as well. They bought a house in Manurewa last year, around $520,000. But you can see that these properties are not going to be snatched up by developers, where developers are paying ridiculous prices for a property with with a bit of land. So these are quite affordable, right? The last one is an apartment. So apartment is not what we sort of not a recommendation, but because it doesn't have the capital gains as what you would have because it has no land. But it's still like if your budget is tight, that's still it's still an option for you. Coming on to property flipping. So this property, you can see that it was sold in November 2020 for $599,000. The person who sold this property actually bought the house for $510,000 2 months prior to selling this. They didn't even settle on the property. So they didn't need to they didn't need to go to the bank and get finance. All they did was sign a contract for $510,000 and put it back onto the market. So obviously the only money he needed at the time was a 5% deposit, right? So at the time would have been like, $25,000 or so. The reason how he did that was obviously he was able to buy under value, obviously getting instant equity upon your purchase. You would buy a property that's got the ability for you to add value. So it might be like a do-up, something that you might want to, something like an old property that might need some new carpet, new paint. Sometimes, first-time buyers are going in with a 10% deposit, but they can't actually afford to do all the other, all the renovations. So that might be an opportunity for you to get a deal. So in this case, this is a double settlement. Double settlement means that he bought a house, he was going to settle it on November 18th. So he bought it in September, and then he was supposed to settle on November the 18th. And prior to the November to 18th, he found another buyer. That buyer bought it for $599. The person who bought this house actually made $80,000 before tax from this flip. If you don't have much deposit, that might be a good way for you to sort of build something up as well. That's pretty much it from me. If you guys have, if you have any questions, or if you guys want to get in touch with us, our email is support@mhq.co.nz, and or you can give us a call on this 0800 number, or you can just Google us.